You're very welcome to this special Thomas Coleman III bursary session of Atheism Explained, ? In the program, we say the following about Tommy Coleman, after whom this session and the bursary is named. Tommy Coleman was a significant contributor to the Religious Studies Project and the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network, whose research advanced knowledge in non-religious studies and facilitated the work of many others around him. He completed his PhD with Miguel Farias and Jonathan Zhang at Coventry University and was a colleague and friend to many of us involved in the Explaining Atheism program. All of these things are true, and saying them is appropriate. But on their own, they fail to capture the joy and enthusiasm that Tommy exhibited in his work and in his life. For a number of years, one could hardly fail to see or hear Tommy wherever atheism, psychology of religion, and the cognitive science of religion were being discussed. On podcasts, at conferences, on social media, and in a very impressive range of publications for a scholar who was still working on his doctorate. Tommy wasn't just participating in these discussions, he was asking great questions, whether as an interviewer or an author, drawing connections across areas of scholarship such as philosophy, religious studies, neuroscience, and evolutionary biology. He knew what a privilege it was to have a chance to plug oneself fully into these matters, and it showed. I feel very fortunate to have been the external examiner on his doctoral thesis in April of 2021, which was entitled Psychological Surrogates for Supernatural Belief, a Test of Form and Function. Both at his Viva and in other conversations, I was always impressed by his energy and inspired to do better work to keep up with him and help answer the questions he was always putting to us. Many of us, can get quite burned out by academic work with other demands, and just the sheer enthusiasm and connections Tommy was making brought a bit of joy back into what we were doing. So, of course, we were greatly shocked and saddened when Tommy passed away later in 2021. He would have, for sure, been present here with us and making excellent contributions at this conference, I have no doubt. When we as a program thought about how we might honor Tommy, the obvious action that came to mind was to create an award for PhD students and early career researchers to join us here and share with us their research, their energy, and their questions. Tommy, like many other PhD students and ECRs, faced the challenge of how to pay to attend these types of conferences. Energetic young scholars like Tommy are the future of our field, and are often more attuned to new developments across areas than those of us who have been in the game a bit longer. But they almost always face hurdles in gaining access to meetings like this one. So we are very grateful that Tommy's family gave their agreement to our creation of these bursaries to assist promising early career researchers in participating in this conference. We received many strong applications for these bursaries and feel very fortunate to have been able to make 3 awards. So we'll hear from each of them about their work now. So our recipients are Feryl Badiani from Victoria University of Wellington, speaking on the causes and types of atheism among Hindus. Kevin Muriithi Ndereba from St. Paul's University and Stellenbosch University, Atheism Among Emerging Adults in Africa, a comparative and regional perspective. And Dayal Paleri with Santhosh Raghavan from the Indian Institute of Technology. And their talk is The New in the New Atheism, interrogating the drivers and dynamics of an emerging atheist movement in Kerala, South India. So please welcome, in general, all 3 of our participants, then I'll call up Feryl.
So hello, my name is Feryl Badiani, and today I'm going to be talking about atheism amongst Hindus, or what it kind of would look like. So to start off, I decided, I was like looking for like a cover image for my PPT. I was like, I don't know what to put, so I decided to use AI. And this is what AI gave me, which one shows me that I don't think that they know what an atheist looks like, because I'm pretty sure it wouldn't look like that. But what it also tells me that definitions of atheism or understanding of atheism is kind of based or grounded in moving away from Christianity and not, any other religion. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what atheism amongst Hindus look like. So what does an Indian Hindu atheist even look like? The Indian Hindu identity is deeply, deeply complex, and I'm going to emphasize that I mean Indian Hindu. I don't know what Hinduism looks like in other countries. I'm sure it's the same, but I'm going to emphasize it's Indian Hindu. It's a deeply complex identity. It's made up of where you grow up, your linguistic community belonging, your caste and your class status. Though caste and class interact deeply, they are separate. Do you guys know the difference between them? Do you guys know what caste is? Yes? Yes? Great. I'm not going to explain it then. Great. And so the way these factors interact really affects the kind of atheism or theism that you see amongst Hindus. How do I know this? Because I did interviews. I interviewed Gujaratis and Maharashtrians. So Baroda is a place in Gujarat, Kolhapur is a place in Maharashtra. It's kind of in like central India. And I chose these places because I'm a Gujarati and I've grown up in Maharashtra. So you can look at the screen for like the caste and gender breakup, but that's what I did. The reason I did these interviews was for my PhD thesis. I wasn't really studying atheism. I was studying, the role of Hindu gods and its polytheism and why it exists. Maybe, do the Hindu mental models co-evolve with the community needs? And I was looking at the Gujarati and Maharashtrian communities. And I knew that the Gujarati and Maharashtrian communities are deeply different, the Gujaratis being deeply enterprising and risk-prone, but also they don't really care much for education, whereas Maharashtrians are not deeply, but they're kind of risk-averse in comparison, and they have salaried positions, and they really rely on education for the same. And so while I was exploring this, I came across a pretty significant atheistic population. Okay, but the atheistic population was pretty lopsided in that Maharashtrians were a lot more atheist in nature than Gujaratis. And this is because of creds. And I'm not going to explain that as well because Ayana did that last time, like last session. So I asked people like, how long do you pray for? And they would be like, 2.5 hours. Or they'll be like, I pray for 25 minutes and then I write down the name of Krishna for an hour. Like it's long and elaborate. And I've grown up to this. It's not just prayer. It's highly, highly ritualistic prayer. So Gujaratis usually have like baby Krishna in their temples and they'll pray to him, they'll wake him up, they'll bathe him with lukewarm water, they'll feed him, they'll put out toys for him, then they'll go do everything. Then they'll like pray, they'll chant, then they'll go do their work, they'll come back, they'll put him to bed. It's highly ritualistic prayer, happens on a daily basis. My grandmother does this every day. And then there's prayer in the evening as well. It takes a lot of time. Obviously, you can see it's high in creds, and everyone who lives with them, they'll be exposed to this. And so we found that those people who were not introduced to creds did show a little bit lesser levels of religiosity. So those who lived in joint families, everyone was religious. Every single person was religious. Maybe the younger ones were like not actively participating in ritualistic prayer, but they believed in God. They would pray every day. I have one quote from one participant who lived in a nuclear family who was like, in a nuclear family, I don't really see, the purpose of religion or the role of religion that much. And that's it. So maybe when you're not exposed to like grandmothers and elders doing all these, long ritualistic prayers, you can see a decline in religiosity. As opposed to Maharashtrians, where there's not as much exposure to creds. So the same question: how long do you pray for? 10 minutes max. Not ritualistic at all. They'll like light a diya like a lamp. They'll pray in their mind or like fold their hands in front of the god. That's it. They're in and out. Yeah, exactly. They chant God's name. It's nothing elaborate. The other thing is education. Like I mentioned, Gujaratis don't value education nearly as much as Maharashtrians. Doesn't mean that they don't value education at all. It's just a bit lopsided in their importance. And as you can see, Maharashtra has a lot more higher level education institutes than Gujarat. And it's possible, I did collect my data through snowball sampling, so it's possible that my sample was a lot more skewed, where I had a lot more educated Maharashtrians, but I do think it is representative of the skew in the population broadly. But what is really important and really interesting is the role of caste in mitigating the role of theism amongst Maharashtrians specifically. Amongst Gujaratis, not a difference, did not make a difference at all. But amongst Maharashtrians, 100%. You can see that the upper caste, or the Brahmins, they they maintain religious rigidity, they ascribe high importance to God, and they perform all the rituals and traditions that come with it. So I met this one Brahmin who was like, we worship every day, we go bathe in the river, and then we purify ourselves. It takes us around 45 minutes to an hour to pray, and it goes on until lunchtime. Amongst the middle class, amongst the educated lot, you can see that they reject the importance of God. They still have beliefs about karma, and they don't pray on a daily basis, but they do participate in religious traditions and like these big festivals that happen. So the quote here is, whatever that may take place in our life, I firmly believe that religion doesn't play any role in that. Everything that takes place in our life depends on our efforts, our hard work, and our determination. It's very karma-esque. But the Dalits, the lower caste people, sorry, sneak peek. The Dalits, especially the educated Dalits, they really reject Hinduism. And it's because it's like deeply seeped in, it's a way of rejecting Hinduism, and it's a way of rejecting the prejudicial systems that come with it. So I met this one person who actually started crying during the interview. I was not ready for that. And she goes, no, we believe in Dr. Ambedkar, this massive caste reformist from Maharashtra. As you might be aware of our history, when I was a kid, we used to go to the well to get water, and we had to place our vessel on the ground, and the Hindu Marathas used to pour the water from above. This is basically so there's no, they don't touch the vessels, there's no cross-contamination, basically a sign of untouchability. And so rejecting Hinduism becomes a way of rejecting casteism. And so you see a lot of Dalits who follow or become atheists because of this. But there's this interesting intersection between education and caste, in that those who are aware, so not all Dalits are atheistic. It's especially those who are aware of like anti-caste literature, who become really like, I think it was, I was at a talk, sorry, it was at your talk, where you're talking about like how anger and like emotion really comes before, atheism, is the starting point of atheism. And I think when you read all this literature, you become really aware, and it's really fueled by emotion, and that's when you really reject atheism. And so there's a little quote here, which is like, I asked them, do you believe in God? Do you think God's going to get angry? And they were like, not really, because I've been influenced by Dr. Ambedkar's teaching, so I've never really believed in God. And as I'm learning more, I can't help but move away from it. So I was like, can you tell me more about his teachings? And he was like, he has taught us to move ahead on our own and not to believe in superstitions, especially blindly. Don't believe in God. Instead, study and educate yourself and move ahead in life. So yes, especially awareness about Dalit literature, really, really important in promoting atheism. This is only amongst Maharashtrians, by the way. And why do we see these differences? Because of historical differences between these two communities. Maharashtra has been kind of the epicenter, not talking about the South, I'm sure the South is different, South of India, has been the epicenter of the Dalit movement, or the anti-caste resistance movement in like center and north of India, where, when the Brits came in, the Marathas kind of got together, and the Maratha army allowed for people from every caste to kind of join it, and that led to some caste disruption. There was the Lingayat movement, which is basically a different religion. They sought out to create a new religion, which kind of crossed across all societal groups and borders. Now unfortunately, it has become one caste in Hinduism, but that's another thing. And then it's home to many, many anti-caste freedom fighters, like Dr. Ambedkar, that has been mentioned by many people. And so it's really, anti-caste resistance is really ingrained in the culture of Maharashtra. Whereas Gujarat has voted a very right-wing prime minister to be their chief minister for 12 times in a row. He promotes a branch of Hindutva, which is called Savarna Hinduism, which is Brahminical Hinduism. It promotes caste-based differences. It promotes bad stuff. Sorry. So, in summary, got really nervous out there. In summary, atheism in India is mitigated by exposure to creds and education that we already know about. But interestingly and uniquely, caste also plays a really unique role in influencing theistic beliefs. Education about anti-caste literature is most closely connected to Hinduism. For many in India, a rejection of caste and other prejudicial systems is the main driver for atheism. And while, as I said, I've only done research in Maharashtra and Gujarat, so I can speak for these two communities, I went on the internet and it's kind of well corroborated. So I went to the Indian Atheism page on Facebook, and yeah, that you can see that also talks about casteism, and that is Savarna Hinduism. But yeah, I'll answer questions about it if y'all have any questions, but I'm happy to wrap. Thank you so much. And or if you like any of the artwork, it's done by an amazing atheist Maharashtrian artist called Dayal Paleri, also my ex-boyfriend. But yeah.
Thank you, Feryl, for that wonderful talk. I have a few comments, especially when, first of all, I think the kind of comparison that you make in Maharashtra and Gujarat kind of involves a problem of simplification, because Dalits in not just in Maharashtra but also in Gujarat is obviously known for their anti-caste activities. If you remember the Una struggle, one of the first most fierce anti-caste movement in the recent decade came out of Gujarat. And in Maharashtra, if you kind of move about the Mahas, the Dalits, who is a minuscule population of Maharashtra, the Marathas, the dominant caste, continues to be very religious, also part of, forms the larger part of Shiv Sena, one of the most ferocious religious political group. And also, the kind of comparison between Modi and Gujarat, the parent organization of Modi, the RSS, comes out of Brahmins in Maharashtra, not in Gujarat. So I think, is it fair to compare? I mean, I understand if you compare Dalits in Maharashtra and maybe upper caste in Gujarat, it makes sense. But it does not kind of justify the subnational comparison that you make. Yeah.
Sure, I completely agree with that. Again, like I said, it's based on qualitative data, so maybe quantitative data will say otherwise. But this is regardless of caste. So I did 36 interviews in Gujarat and 39 interviews in Kolhapur, trying to account for like different stratas of the caste system. And in Gujarat, people were, one, really shy to talk about their caste, barely spoke about it. And regardless of whoever's house I went to, so one of my free listening questions was, what are the qualities of a trustworthy community member? Qualities. They'd be like, Narendra Modi. Didn't even ask. I literally didn't even ask. So you see that kind of passion, the kind of patriotism is much stronger amongst even my sample of lower caste Gujaratis. Could be wrong. Like I said, problem with sampling, could be snowball sampling. But across, everyone loved Modi. And sure, that was very reductive, absolutely. There are other, this is not to say that Gujarat doesn't have anti-caste movements, it was just not prominent. Whereas in Maharashtra, to be a Dalit has become a part of one's pride. They talk about it. Like if you meet someone, I don't even have to ask them about their caste. They'll just be like, as a Dalit man or as a Dalit woman, blah, 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 as a da-da-da-da-da. And it's a really integral part of their identity. Again, in my sample, I could be very wrong. And agreed, like I said, with the middle caste Marathas, you're very right. But like I said, it's the educated Marathas. It's not those that have not pursued higher education, and there could be exceptions. But I hope I've low-key answered your question.
Thanks. I was interested to see Narendra Dabolkar's name on your slide as someone who'd inspired one of the people, because, of course, he was assassinated.
Sorry, whose name? Sorry.
Narendra Dabolkar. There.
yes.
Yeah, that's right. Slide before, maybe? The slide before, it was lots of quotes from the... There we go. Narendra in KR14.
Sure.
Yeah. And obviously one of his... I knew him very well. And one of his... ideas was that there was this long tradition of atheism, and he drew on that very much in saying, why this was an Indian tradition, and was very, strong about it. How far were the people that you were talking to, especially the Dalits, conscious of that sort of traditional aspect of the beliefs that they might have?
To be fair, to be honest, I really haven't heard of Narendra Dabolkar, and it's probably a limitation of my anti-caste reading. I have been limited to Ambedkar and Phule, etc. But no, I didn't. I think this was the only participant that kind of mentioned it. Yeah, mentioned him. I don't think they're aware of the long-standing tradition about atheism. I think knowledge about atheism is very common since, not very common, I mean, I'm trying to put it better. You know what? So Dr. Ambedkar, he led a massive, massive movement where he led like mass conversion. So in Rajasthan, they mass converted from Hinduism to Buddhism. So I wouldn't even say atheism unless you consider Buddhism to be atheism, which it is because it was created to move away from Hinduism. So that's your own thing. So I wouldn't say they're aware of the long-standing tradition of atheism. I think since Ambedkar made it a lot more popular, not just Ambedkar, all the anti-caste revolutionaries made it more popular. They're aware of its position as like of resistance. But yeah.
So we just have time for one more quick question and response.
Okay. I was hoping you can add a little layer of class to your discussion of caste, because there was one of the quotes that you included from the middle caste folks that said something very interesting, which, you know, basically I'm working hard and I'm getting these good results, and so, you know, I don't really need religion anymore. And that speaks to me a little bit of like this capitalist ideology, right? Like sort of replacing like this very Weberian model of rationalization. And so I'm wondering if you see that take place in both of the middle caste and the lower caste, and if that can be factored into this discussion, or if you think it's really more about the like political rejection of caste driving this.
Can you repeat the question, but simpler?
What's the role of
Sorry.
capitalism here?
Sorry?
What's the role of capitalism here?
Yeah. I don't think I'm fully qualified to answer this question because it's really, really complicated. It's deeply complicated. I can speak to my experience because I grew up in Mumbai, and so class becomes a really good way to garb caste. You can move away, you can change your class, and you can't really change your caste, and you do find like lower caste people who are rich, but you can't. It's rare, right? Like it's a persisting system for a reason. International education institutes have become a way to keep lower caste people out of, you know, the upper caste areas because it's like international and it's English speaking, and it's another way of like moving away from them, and then it becomes like really harder to access. So it's really, really so deeply intertwined that I just can't begin to pull it apart with my expertise. But maybe Dayal and Santhosh maybe could know better. But personally, I don't have the expertise to answer that question.
Thank you very much, Feryl, and for those great questions.
Great. Kevin from Kenya. The other two names are pretty difficult, but Landman has done a good job to pronounce them. I come from St. Paul's University, Kenya. I'm talking about atheism among emerging adults in Africa. So a few years back, I actually presented in another network, the International Research Network for the Study of Science and Belief in Society. I was interested in the often disregarded demographic of African non-religious young people. And that research was published in 2023, and that's the title there. The focus was on Kenya, which is in East Africa, just in case you may want to know. And this year, we wanted to just expand that a little bit. So we got in touch. I think what you have in the program is slightly different. So of those three co-researchers, let me call them that. And we wanted to just look at a broader perspective, just look at Kenya, Burundi, Benin, and Ivory Coast to just compare what is going on in terms of atheism in that context. And then emerging adulthood, of course, you can see the ages there, 18 to 29, but that's the definition in terms of age. But then I expanded this to 35 for reasons which I will explain, and we used qualitative questionnaires. So we're just playing off or responding to this claim that has been made by John Beattie, a philosopher of religion, who did his PhD at Cambridge. And he has this quote, "Africans are incurably religious," which has informed a lot of religious research, at least by and large in Africa. But then we are seeing in terms of the census in several parts of the continent, certainly in Kenya, a demographic of those who are identifying as either atheists or no religion or not sure, those kinds of questions in the census. Yet this demographic is understudied. So we wanted to just press in and question this claim that has been made within religious scholarship, within theological scholarship, and even sociology of religion. So there's that neglect. That's what I'm saying. We want to respond to that. But in terms of the theoretical framing, using emerging adulthood theory, but then contextualizing that within African contextual realities, ethnicity, etc., etc. So contextualizing the discourse to fit with African realities, and then the argument that Africa is also not not a country. So the diversity in the African continent, and I'm sure we're just scratching the surface. By and large, only besides the article that I shared with you, there is maybe a few other, maybe let's say less than 5 pieces of research that have focused on non-religion in Africa. Actually, if you just do a quick search, you'll find that it's not so much, but none of it is based on empirical research, listening to the actual young people who identify this way. So the diversity of Africa, so Kenya is, let's see. Okay, the small one is Burundi. We can't see like the orange, that's Burundi. It's East Africa together with Kenya. And then you have the last two, Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire and Benin. Benin and Ivory Coast are in Francophone Africa. They largely speak, that's the official language based on the colonial history. But of course, they have their own ethnic languages. Same thing with Kenya, same thing with Burundi. So for perspective, in Kenya, where I come from, English and Kiswahili are the official languages, but then we have 56 ethnicities all speaking their own languages. So I speak, my ethnicity is Kikuyu. So typically, a typical African is multilingual because of some of those things. All right, so the 3 research questions that were guiding us: is there a connection between emerging adulthood and atheist identities? I'm sure this is a path that has been well trod. What are the unique social, ethnic, cultural, and psychological factors influencing African atheism? How might African atheist identities contribute to the global discourse on non-religion? Obviously, this is just basic knowledge that will be known to many of us. Emerging adulthood is neither childhood nor adulthood, so it's a distinct life stage of human development, championed by people like Jeffrey Arnett and others. So the ages are given, this 18, 19 to 29 years, but for our context in Africa, we expanded this to 35 years because the markers that would define this stage include things like, looking for work or having cleared like high school education, beginning a family, and all those things in the African setting, of course, stretch a little bit further. And then, of course, we are guided by, at least in the Kenyan context, the Kenyan Constitution, which defines that age as, 18, 19 to 35. But also the African Union Charter, which again gives the policy framing for the other countries in the study. Again, would expand that to 35 years. Emerging adulthood, of course, is conversation around the search for identity from people like James Fowler and Eric Erikson, and then a stage of course, meaning making. And again, this is also tempered in the African context when you think about issues like family breakdown and the social and political dynamics that affect many of our societies. Then again, that looks a little bit different. So as we say, or as Gathers is a practical theologian in South Africa says, that it isn't really identity finding, but identity discovery, right? Identity discovery. Then, of course, this particular research hones in on non-religion. So qualitative semi-structured surveys were done among or with 21 African emerging adults, ethical clearance, consent, all that good stroke boring stuff, depending on your level of humor. Translation services were offered by some of the core researchers. In a place like Burundi, you have English and French, and Kirundi is the other language. So some people, the questions had been framed in English because I'm the one who's doing the, just framing or coming up with the instrument, but then had to be translated to French. And in some cases, like in Burundi, when the questionnaire is administered, some of the people may respond in Kirundi because they are more familiar, they are more comfortable with that language. So all that multilingual context again colored the research. Then the coding and analysis. Let me talk about the findings. The demographics, one could say, I think from the research, it tended towards more male, and we could say young and diverse in terms of the atheism You can see atheists, those who say they're atheist, animist, agnostic. There was a question that asked, how would you define your non-religious identity? So these were some of the responses. Some said non-religious, irreligious, non-believer, Rastafari, interesting, deist, freethinker, spiritualist. Then animism as an African category of atheism, especially in Ivory Coast context. So in Ivory Coast, in the census, they don't have a category of atheism. And so there was an interesting debate among us as the co-researchers, especially those in West Africa, and they were saying that many were identifying as animists because of the stigma attached with saying, no religion or atheism. First of all, the category does not exist. And then animism in the traditional sense, in the scholarship, people would, in the traditional way it's been understood is kind of this belief in these African traditional practices and veneration of ancestors, etc. But others see it also from a philosophical perspective whereby it could either take a supernaturalistic perspective and also could be a naturalistic perspective. So that was interesting discussion both in the literature but among the researchers around what might be going on in a place like Ivory Coast, where there are so many people who they would say they're animists that may say, I do not worship any god, as we'll see shortly from some of the data. Then, of course, close social structures of kinship. Of course, many societies in Africa are more collectivist. That also tempers the discussion. Then factors affecting atheism, influencing, perhaps you could say, excessive charismaticism, families of origin and colonial trauma. I think this is another big one, which I will talk about briefly. So demographics in terms of the age, of course, and then in terms of the previous religious affiliation, some said Christian, others were more specific, evangelical Christian, Protestant Christian, or Roman Catholic Christian. We have African instituted churches. So in terms of the other definition, like Christian identity in Kenya, for example, you have missionary founded churches through the colonial enterprise, like Presbyterianism, for example. But then you also have people who kind of contextualize that or inculturated Christianity to fit into African philosophical thinking or African worldviews or things like that. So there is, that also is not included here, but could be behind it. Then there was one Hindu person as well in the research, because also we have some of these other religions in Africa. So I think one of the things I think that I could see is just the diversity in definition of atheism. So one, for example, says, I don't believe in religion at all, but I do know that there is a supreme being who exists. I'm just as confused as you are. So that's interesting, right? Then in terms of the other markers, you can see on the right side, atheist, agnostic. Some said irreligious, non-believer, and some said other. Then animism. Animism, I think for me was a big thing, and I think maybe more needs to be done there. But Pierre, you have one of the respondents. I come from an African family with customs and traditions to respect. In other words, an animist family, because this has always been the practice in Africa in general before Islam and Christianity made some Africans lose their heads. Firstly, it teaches me the importance of my family and my ancestors who do so much for my well-being, protecting me from evil, helping me to overcome life's trials and tribulations, and helping me to make the right choices and decisions. In the past, African families were much more spiritual than religious, but with colonialism, many African families have become religious. I describe my non-religious identity as not conforming to the writings of the holy books. Again, an interesting thing. Leading my life as I wish. Factors of atheism, the third finding I could say, there are three things. Excessive charismaticism. So one of the large Christian expressions in Africa is what people call Pentecostalism or charismaticism. And the excessive practice of that, people have an issue with it because it has this high power orientation. There's this person who they have to pay money to. You can't question the man of God or woman of God kind of discourse. And you can see this even from the first two responses. I also am not hysterically involved with pastors making the congregation to shout amen when I listen to the word being given. I internally dissect it to make it more personal and true as per what I have learned from books. This was from one who identifies as a free thinker. religions impoverish the faithful for the benefit of those in power. So their critique towards religion is not necessarily to the entire Christian religious identity, because they are of many stripes, but seem to be specific with regards to a type of Christianity in Africa, at least in the countries that we were surveying. The second one is on colonial trauma. PID 9, very articulate. The proselytization of Christianity within sub-Saharan Africa goes hand in hand with the European colonialist project. Christianity was a tool of empire. The goal of Christianizing Africans was part and parcel of the goal of civilizing Africans, or at least the goal of making us just productive enough to be useful cogs in the colonial institutions that served to extract as much value as possible from our land for the purposes of their enrichment. There's also the fact that a lot of support for socially and fiscally conservative policies rely on appeals to religious belief, etc., etc., etc. And then the family of origin, some of the respondents were raised in, some of them were raised in non-religious families, but a smaller minority were actually raised in religious families, strong religious families. And some of them, from the ones on the right, actually say that they would identify as non-religious. So they found security in identifying that way because of the values of love and understanding that were shared in their family of origin, which was Christian. To conclude, to answer the questions, I saw that there are connections between emerging adulthood theory and atheist identities. This is maybe nothing new compared to what currently exists. Varied atheist identities, Stephen Balivan, I think, has defined atheism in some of his works. Question 2, African contextual realities. Africa's colonial history is a significant issue in African atheism. The interplay of religion in negative politics in contemporary context is also something else. So religion has its both positive values, but also when we look at our history, there's problems there, and young people increasingly question how Christianity has been used, and religion has been used by and large to subjugate others. Question 3, African atheism in global discourse. I think the whole question on animism to me was something surprising and unexpected. I actually didn't know what to do once I found that. But these are the results I found out, and that's a little bit about atheism among emerging adults in Africa.
Thanks, Kevin. That's so interesting. I really enjoyed it. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about kind of the atheist cultures that you were discovering in this context. You spoke a bit about animism and some of the identities around that, but to say a little bit more about the atheist culture. I'm aware, I don't know so much about these regions, but places in which, like Richard Dawkins' work, turns one of the most interesting things about New Atheism, I think, is its life outside of the West, which is really interesting and ambivalent and kind of follows colonial trajectories in really kind of odd, sometimes unsettling, sometimes empowering. Like, I think there's really interesting things that go on around that. And I just wanted to have a bit more of a sense of these atheist identities. So bringing it into contact with your idea about colonial trauma and Christianity being identified as a tool of colonial powers, but kind of connecting that with ideas that atheism is sometimes an artifact of soft empire, replicating colonial trajectories and so on. So is there ambivalence around kind of ideas around atheism? Is it a really distinctive kind of atheist culture that you find in some of these settings? So just, a bit more about.
I think the next scholars who will be sharing, I think we'll talk more about that as well. But we see the same thing. Many of them, actually, in the other research that I did 2 years ago, many of them have read Dawkins and Hitchens and the Four Horsemen, so they're familiar with them. But I tend to find also, in that sense, the nuance is what I find problematic, and I would argue then that it seems they're just taking it wholesale. So, for example, very oversimplistic or generalizations around religions as if they are all the same. So that's something. There's a lot of, again, negative, critical anger towards the colonial history. While not, for example, looking at the data, for example, in Ethiopia, for instance, you have churches there that go all the way back to 4th, 5th century. So Christianity has actually been in the continent of Africa for a long time. Scholars like Thomas Oden argue actually that it was shaped in Africa. If you look at Christianity, for example, Augustine and others, lived in the continent. But that kind of data is not usually, those arguments are not embraced by atheists in at least a Kenyan context. So nuance, I think, is needed. In terms of identity, they meet up, they have places they hang out, have beers, and every Saturday they'll meet up and do that kind of thing.
Any other questions? Kevin, yes.
Thank you, Kevin. Really, really interesting. I'd like to ask you a bit more about the animists, because the quotes you had there, they struck me as somewhat new age-ish. This whole conversation about I'm spiritual, not religious, and then the emphasis on individualism. I choose whatever I do. So I'm just wondering whether some of these people growing up within an urban context, how much contact do they have with indigenous religions from Africa? And I'm thinking of the example, what I know, for example, from Brazil, where you have some Afro-Brazilian religions which have picked elements from indigenous cultures in Brazil, but I mean, it's actually a made-up representation. When you move into the indigenous religions, that they don't do anything like what's happening in this Afro-Brazilian religion. So it's something which has been made up in the early 20th century. So I'm wondering about how much I can see the whole colonial argument, anti-colonial, but how much in touch are these people who claim to be animists in contact with the native indigenous religion?
So obviously, I think with, unless you maybe look at, a place like Amazon where you have these communities that are locked away from the rest of community and define that as indigenous would be a bit different, at least in the Kenyan context. And of course, indigenous religions are not static, right? They're dynamic. So I would argue even those who would identify in the, like as Islam or Christian today, they still have the African traditional or indigenous, I define it that way, worldview influencing how they look at life. One. Two, some of them will actually go mix practices. So some may identify as Christian, but they may go during the week to a witch doctor, etc., for example, to find a solution for an existential issue or crisis that they are facing. So I think in those ways, we can still say that animism still influences. Then in everyday African contemporary life, think of a ritual like in a practice like marriage. Even those who will do a Christian wedding still would do other traditional ceremonies for weddings. Like in my community, for example, there are 3 traditional ceremonies that you do before the, say, white wedding, which are part of the tradition. That still continues even today. So in many ways, it's integrated into cultural or religious practice. Yeah.
Thanks very much to Kevin and to our questioners. Thanks very much.
So before we continue our conversation on non-Western atheism, let me join John and all of you in remembering and honoring the memories of Tommy Coleman. It's a really privilege to be a recipient of a bursary that's named after such a wonderful scholar and a human. Yeah. So let me continue our presentations on non-Western atheism. So today we are going to talk about the rise of new atheism in Kerala, a very different story from very different parts of India that Feryl presented, but has very interesting relations, especially in relation to caste. So this is part of a broader project on new atheism in Kerala that me and Santhosh, and in collaboration with Johannes from University of Zurich, is conducting now. So today it's a tentative one, it's a work in progress thing. So we'll be largely presenting our findings on the content analysis of the new atheist movement, and the ethnographic studies are being carried out simultaneously. So in 2023, Essence Global, one of the new atheist organization in Kerala, have claims to have conducted the largest atheist meeting in the world. It has been attended by almost 10,000 people. No wonder India has a lot of people. So and the kind of discussion that this event had was not just on religion. It was on varied topics, including religious morality, communism, capitalism, the uniform civil code, which is a very heated debate in India, and even to herbal medicine. And the event also released a Malayalam translation of Richard Dawkins' 1976 book Selfish Gene. So you know where the kind of inspiration that comes from.
So this guy, C. Ravichandran, often being called as RC, or by his followers as Richard Dawkins of Kerala, was the kind of figurehead of this organization, Essence Global, and he's an English teacher. He was not a scientist like Richard Dawkins. Even an English teacher who turned an atheist activist, and he has a background. I mean, he comes from an upper caste background. That is very important as we unfold the rest of the session. And his father was a communist, and his mother was a very religious person. And neither communist socialization or religious socialization did not work in his case, as we'll see it. And he was not an active atheist activist until late 2000s, and he was a passive atheist, as he self-described. He also said the 9/11 actually kind of inspired him to come out and be an aggressive atheist activist. And he became a figure in Kerala's public sphere after he kind of translated Richard Dawkins' God delusion as Atheist God, or Nastikanaya Deva in Malayalam, in 2009. And he has ever since authored almost 20 books on a wide variety of topics. And the organization that he led is known as Essence Global. As the name suggests, it's a global organization. It has its organizational presence among the Malayali, the Kerala diasporas in many parts of the world, primarily in English-speaking world. And it has a very strong online presence. It has at least 3 active YouTube channels, and it has a cumulative YouTube view of around, I only count the YouTube around 107 million, 3 times the population of Kerala itself. And as I said, they have direct influence by the New Atheist. And Richard Dawkins often tweet some of the details of the events of Essence Global. And Ravichandran also travels to, for example, in the US, and conduct varied religious debates with people from the West, both religious and non-religious. So the question that we are asking in this presentation is, what is actually new about New Atheism in Kerala or in India generally? And this is not a new question at all. We have seen this interesting question being asked in the Western context. There has been a lot of answers to this. Primarily, there has been skeptical answers. There is nothing new. This is just an evangelical repackaging of the old atheism in the West. But there has been a lot of literature on how internet and new social media has kind of enabled this newer rigor and that's kind of defines New Atheism. And there has been discussion on the newness in relation to the use of science and the tone of the atheist discourse, and also there has been literature on how the New Atheism is defined as a form of identity politics, or with an assertion of atheist identities, especially in the postmodern age. So what we are interested and we are trying to understand is, how do we make sense of New Atheism beyond the West? And if we are to understand New Atheism, as a form of the defense of the position of the white middle class male and modernity itself, as Stephen Ney would say, how do we understand the articulation of New Atheism in the West, in non-West? And we kind of tentatively argue that in order to understand the articulation of New Atheism, even though it is visibly inspired from the Western New Atheism, its newness actually lies in the distinctiveness of the local Kerala context or the larger Indian context, especially the context of a caste society. So little bit on the Kerala context. Kerala is a very peculiar and interesting case because it is one of the most religiously diverse states in India. It has a very substantial population of Muslims and Christians, apart from the Hindus. And it was often discussed in the academic literature for its model of development, a very high development index, but combined with a very low per capita income, and often noted for the strong communist presence. It was one of the first state, or one of the first place where Communist Party was democratically elected to power as early as 1957, and they still continue to it still runs the government on different intervals. It remains one of the strongest political party there. And it also has a very long history of rationalist movement, kind of, they never use the word atheist, they actually use the word yuktivadi, or the one who used reason. So the atheism was a kind of subsumed in the rationalist movement in Kerala. And most importantly, elsewhere in India, Kerala is also a caste society. So don't have time to elaborate on caste, but caste is a form of enclosed class where social mobility between classes are not possible. So Ambedkar would, as she mentioned, Ambedkar would describe caste as a form of grade and inequality. And so understanding caste is very important in understanding the old atheism of Kerala, which is broadly known as the rationalist movement. It was actually a movement that arose against the rational social structure of caste, because caste has a strong legitimization in the Hindu ritual and theological substance, and it actually simultaneously critiqued Hinduism, also caste in other religions, as well as the actual social practice of caste. And Sahodran Ayyappan, he was one of the founders of the rationalist movement. He actually started the magazine Yuktivadi, broadly translated rationalism, as early as in 1929. And it actually later formed into Kerala Yuktivadi Sangam, or Kerala Rational Association, in the 1960s. And it actually formed close alliances with religious reformist organizations. For example, those organizations that tend to be anti-caste and modernize religious traditions, as well as with the communist parties. So that was the long history of the rationalist movement. And the new atheism in Kerala kind of makes a break from this existing rationalist tradition. As I said, Ravichandran came into the public scene with the translation of Richard Dawkins' book. And then actually he was kind of invited to various organizations, and then his followers grew, and that's when he launched his own organization. And there was subsequent split within the kind of organization that Ravichandran formed, especially following certain positions on gender, and also on their alleged affinity to Hindu nationalists and so on. So one can actually write a separate paper on the split within the New Atheist in Kerala. So the organization that we'll be talking about is Essence Global. As I said, it's the most assertive organized New Atheist collective in Kerala, and it has chapters all over the Kerala as well as in different parts of the world. And apart from the kind of online engagement, they also have extensive public engagement through debates and panel discussion, study classes, and of late they have also been organizing summer camps for students. I think they kind of understood the role of religious socialization, and they actually use the summer camps to kind of replace religion with science as a form of socialization. And what the most interesting thing about the kind of articulation of Ravichandran's New Atheism, it has a lot of similarity with the New Atheism, especially New Atheism in the West, or atheist right in the West, especially in their position to gender, Islam, communism, and capitalism. So I will just briefly look at few of the lectures, the most popular lectures that kind of defines his understanding of these important social matters or questions of social power. So it's very difficult to translate the one of them. The Oracle's Wife is a lecture where he actually kind of presented alleged the women of families are kind of instruments of religious organization to kind of discipline the atheist men. So it has actually created a big role in the new atheist traditions, because Ravichandra's imagination of new atheist is essentially an upper caste male atheist. And also the other lecture called Left Means Islam, where he actually accuses there is an alliance of Islam or left, and in today's Kerala or India, to be left is to be supportive of Islam. So this is the gist of his argument, but very detailed and kind of substantiated in his own terms. And also his lecture on Flowers of Caste is essentially a case against affirmative action based on caste. And there's a long history of affirmative action based on caste in Kerala, goes back, in India, goes back to the formation of independent India. And then there is a very interesting lecture on capitalism, where he actually makes a very interesting phrase, maybe must have been derivative from the New Atheist, where he actually says secularism in economics is capitalism and religion in economics is communism. So that's a very interesting, this is the kind of position that he kind of articulates. And the other interesting thing that we observed is the New Atheist articulation has a very clear overlapping with the Hindu nationalist politics. And Ravichandran has also been critical of Hindutva in several ways, but not in the critical junctures where actual Hindu nationalist ideologies are anchors in. Just an example, these are the kind of lectures that he gave around the state on critical issues or critical decisions that Hindu nationalists have taken in the last 10 years. In the first lecture, The Birth of the Citizen, he actually made a defense of the very controversial Citizenship Amendment Act. And this is a defense of this is a case, the Uniform Civil Code. Oh, sorry, I didn't put the translation there. The second lecture is a case against the minority rights and a case for Uniform Civil Code, which the Hindu nationalists have been arguing for some time. And here is another lecture against the farmers' protest that has been happening in India, where he kind of pushes his capitalistic logic in order to substantiate the recent anti-peasant farm laws that Modi government was forced to retrieve after the protest later. And here is a lecture on the controversial Article 370, where the BJP government has taken away the regional autonomy for Kashmir, the only Muslim majority state in India. Yeah, so Santhosh will take from here on, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dayal. And let me also use this opportunity to thank the organizers for this opportunity and also to facilitate my stay here. So basically, as Dayal was explaining, we are trying to understand what are the specificities of New Atheism in an entirely different context, which had a very different history and social context compared to that of the West. So what are the new in the New Atheism in Kerala? So Ravichandran tends to present New Atheism as a post-enlightenment atheism. So basically, he argues that the kind of ideas of New Atheism is very different from that of the Enlightenment atheism, because here they are not only against religion but every form of secular religions, and basically in this context he is aiming, or he is targeting communism, equating it with religion. So for him, a free thinking person would be against any sort of dogmas, any sort of organized ideology. So a free thinking person has to be always an independent person. And as we mentioned, this particular New Atheism has a very clear break from the anti-caste and kind of a communist affiliations of the earliest rationalist movement in Kerala. So this is the most important shift that we are identifying, and this is something very, very telling. So this shift is away from the communist ideologies. This shift is towards a kind of a rightist orientation. The shift is also towards a kind of a neoliberal economic positioning. And one of the very important slogans, one of the very important catchy phrase that he uses is fact-based politics. So we know that the kind of politics cannot be based on facts alone. So there is a kind of a very strong opposition to any ideological mooring, and that is something important, a critique of ideological orientation of politics. And he, of course, throughout his presentations, throughout his performances online as well as offline, there is a critique of religion, but it is always a kind of a graded one. And he is much softer towards Hinduism, and some of his organizers tend to explain that because Hinduism, unlike that of Christianity or Islam, does not have an institutional character, it does not have a formalized clergy. So that is why he is not kind of criticizing Hinduism the way he criticizing Islam and Christianity. But his criticism against Hinduism has been very, very soft. And also, his kind of dismissal of the political Hinduism is least critical of the kind of very fascist and majoritarian tendencies of the current regime, and he just glosses over many of these things, and very disproportionate critique of Islam. And there was an establishment of ex-Muslims in Kerala in 2021, and this particular group has, at least a faction of them, have very strong affiliation with this particular New Atheist groups. And as in the case of New Atheism, they are at its worst when it comes to ridiculing the symbols and text and stories of Islam. Now, so basically we tend to argue, or we try to argue that New Atheism is a kind of a reflection of the social of the Indian society. So that's what we try to kind of put forward for your consideration. So it's a dismissal and a refutation of the centrality of caste and its Brahminical ideological foundation as a structuring feature of Indian society and its continuing salience. So if you look at even the anti-caste lectures of Ravichandran and others, he tend to criticize every caste almost uniformly, okay? Without understanding the centrality of the Brahminical ideology and the cultural and structural factors that perpetuate that ideology, and how class, caste, gender, and power relations are structured by this formulation. So this kind of a deeper understanding is very much either missing because of the lack of understanding, or there is a tendency to deliberately distort this kind of a deeper understanding. An imagination of a scientifically oriented group of free, modern Homo sapiens marching towards a well-defined culture. So that is that's what he announces, that the current era, we are all modern. There is a generation of modern free-thinking individuals who have the history in their own hands, are capable of defining their life, and that's the kind of an imagination. A distorted understanding of the complex socio-historical composition of the social of the Indian society and absence of a project for its socio-political emancipation. So all these rhetoric, all these arguments really reflect that either lack of understanding or a proclivity towards a distorted understanding of Indian society. The apolitical, rightist, neoliberal positions and weaponized scientism that he uses reflect this particular tendency and this particular scenario. So these are the further questions that we want to pursue. A sociological inquiry into the generation of new atheists. What are their caste, class, social background, aspirations, identifications, etc. And then questions on sociality, identity, and morality that these movements generate. And mode of public engagement, polemic, rhetoric, and technology. There are a lot of things to look into the use of new technology, the internet and other things, and about that. And regional variations of such movements across India. And also the kind of an increasing critique against new atheism from religious groups, especially Islamists, then rationalists and communists. So it's a very fertile area, and then we look forward to conducting more research in this area. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dayal and Santhosh. So we just have time for one or two questions. Conrad.
I'm just wondering about the central government reaction to this movement. What does the BJP
Conrad, hold on just a moment and ask your question.
What does the BJP think about these guys?
Yeah, can you hear me? I think I'm audible. Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. So one thing to note that this is not the only new atheist assertion in Kerala, but the most visible and most influential one. And the new atheists, the Essence Global that we are talking about, often conduct a lot of debates with the Hindu nationalists, and they are quite familiar. And some of them also appear in some of the Hindu nationalist ideological events. For example, Hindu nationalists also have their intellectual platform, and they organize a lot of debates. So as Phil was talking about yesterday, there was also a tendency to define Hinduism as a broad umbrella of different trajectories, including a tradition of atheist. So there are Hindu nationalist leaders in Kerala or in India who identified as atheist. Someone would argue that Savarkar, who was the founder of Hindutva, was an atheist. I mean, that there was that tradition of atheism within Hindu nationalist sensibilities. And most interestingly, recently when BJP's national president came to Kerala, and he has also made an appeal to the BJP workers that they should also consider, trying to reach out to the tradition of Nastikas or the non-believers in Kerala, because that can also be defined, because the definition of Hindutva is not a religious definition alone, right? It is a civilizational, cultural definition, using the definition of holy land and fatherland. So it leaves room for non-believers to also be part once they're committed to the majoritarian project. So I think so they were also trying to engage very positively with them. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Just time for one more. So.
Hi, this was great. Can you hear me? Is this working? Okay, cool. I was really fascinated because we've talked a lot about how religious socialization is important. And on one of your slides, you had this an activity for children, and it's for under 13. But also how I interpreted this was that he's not just converting the typical idea of what we have is it's young kids these days, they don't want to believe in Jesus anymore, but he's actually converting adults with families, and so he's converting full families. So first question is have you been to one of those children activity stuff? Is it child-led? Is it led by younger adults? Because peer culture, like Lois mentioned earlier. And then secondly, because it's 13 and under, do you find that there's teenagers and young adults who are kind of mad that their parents have given up God, and these kids who are now worried that their parents are going to go to hell?
So I have not been to one of them, but I have been invited to some of them in the future. So very interestingly, but they also upload a lot of videos about the summer camps in the YouTube channel. So I have a sense of what's going on. So it's actually not, it's a science camps actually. So it is primarily adult-led. I mean, people including Ravichandran and a bunch of people who are active in Essence Global, who are primarily, science educated themselves, kind of organizes various. So, there is idea of the major aim of the camp is to inculcate scientific temper, right? Because inculcating scientific temper is being put in the Article 51 of Indian Constitution, and that's how they kind of project it. So it involves various science activities, group activities, and there is not much direct religious criticism involved in the camp, as I understand.
How is it different from school? Like, why do kids want to go there?
So the idea, so that's very interesting, because many of the schools in Kerala, at least half of them, are run by religious organizations. For example, the Christian, Muslim, and even some of the Hindu organization have their own schools, which also receive heavy grant from the state government. We call this aided schools, also colleges. So one of the problem that they have been saying that even if you teach evolution in the science class, there will be a class on religious moral in the next session, and it kind of does not. So people, the students will go through really scientific education, but does not kind of internalize scientific logic. So here the idea is to kind of use science as a method to understand. So, or the science worldview. It's not just to, and it also has to do with the education system in Kerala and India in general, which is heavily test exam oriented, right? So that is another thing that they kind of want to replace with. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop beating the bush after this. What about like the children who are worried about their parents going to hell? I really want to know. Sorry.
So in my understanding, in participating in the events organized by Essence Global, I think many of the children who are being part of these things are from the families who are kind of have an inclination towards uh, uh, this particular movement, because this is a new activity they have started, and it's a very growing movement. It's a very young organization. It started in 2018. So I don't think they haven't been able to reach out to children from religious families. So this is kind of confined to families who are already been part of this movement in some way or the other. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Dayal, Santhosh, and for those questions. We've come to the end of proceedings today, but please thank all of our presenters in this excellent session. Thanks very much, everyone.